Memphis covers more land than Chicago. Sit with that for a second, because Chicago is one of the densest, most vertical cities in the country, and Memphis, the largest city sitting directly on the Mississippi River, sprawls across even more ground than it does. But Memphis has fewer than half the people. It's about the population of Boston, spread thin across roughly 7 times the space. Because Memphis is the one American city that managed to get bigger and emptier at the exact same time, and it's now the only one openly trying to shrink itself on purpose. Every thriving American city grows the same way, and almost nobody stops to notice the pattern. They grow by concentrating. People pile in, land gets scarce, buildings climb, and the place gets denser, richer, and more inward-facing with every decade. That's the whole game. Pack more life into less ground and the value compounds. Restaurants, jobs, transit, and rent all rising together in a tight knot at the center. New York did it, San Francisco did it, Chicago did it, climbing skyward along the lake until it became one of the densest places in the country. Even sprawling Sunbelt cities, for all their highways, still pull wealth and energy toward a recognizable core. Getting bigger, for an American city, has always meant getting denser. Memphis spent roughly 50 years doing the precise opposite. Instead of building up and pulling in, it pushed out. It reached past its own edges and swallowed land in every direction. Farmland, subdivisions, whole new towns, stretching its boundary across the map until the people inside it were scattered thinner and thinner. The city got physically enormous while its center quietly drained. And here's the loop I want you to hold on to for the next 15 minutes. Why would a city choose a strategy that practically guaranteed it would hollow itself out? Because that's the real story here. The question isn't whether Memphis declined. The question is why it engineered its own decline on purpose, decade after decade, with the paperwork to prove it. By every rule of American geography, Memphis should have become a monster of a metropolis. The site practically begged for it. In 1819, speculators laid out a town on the Chickasaw bluff, high ground standing safely above the Mississippi, looking down on the one river that drained the heart of a continent. That bluff mattered more than anything drawn on a surveyor's map. While New Orleans sweltered in the flood-prone delta downstream, Memphis sat dry and commanding on the last great rise before the river ran south to the Gulf. Then came cotton, and then came rail. The Mid-South's cotton poured through Memphis on its way to the world, and the city became the largest spot market for the crop on the planet. Picture the riverfront in its prime, steamboats stacked at the landing, the bluff above lined with brokers' offices, and bales by the tens of thousands rolling down to the wharf where men loaded them onto barges bound downriver. The whole regional economy ran on the price of cotton, and that price was set in large part right here. Then 3 western rail routes converged on the city, stitching the riverboat trade to the iron tracks pushing across the country. Goods, money, and people funneled through this one point on the bluff because the land funneled them. For the entire Mid-South, Memphis wasn't just a city. It was the indispensable hub, the place everything had to pass through. The knot where the river and the rails tied themselves together. Remember that bluff and that river, because we're going to come back to them. A city this perfectly placed, this rich in cotton and rail and water, should never empty out. So what on earth broke it? And if you enjoy the hidden logic behind why American cities turned out the way they did, take a second to subscribe, because this is the one that breaks every rule in the book. In 1879, the state of Tennessee did something to Memphis that has happened to almost no major American city before or since. It erased it. Not the buildings, not the river, not the people who remained, the city itself. Legally, Memphis simply stopped being a city. The cause was horror. In 1878, yellow fever swept the bluff, and it killed more than 5,000 people. Out of roughly 47,000, residents, about half fled in terror, pouring out of town on trains and wagons to escape a disease nobody understood. A sickness that turned its victims yellow and filled the streets with the dead faster than they could be buried. Those who could leave, left. Those who couldn't, gambled with their lives, and thousands of them lost. The tax base evaporated almost overnight and the city went bankrupt. So in 1879, Tennessee revoked its charter and reduced Memphis to something called a taxing district, a place with no mayor, no city council, no real government of its own. On paper, the great river hub of the Mid-South had been demoted to an administrative leftover, a name on a ledger rather than a living city. What pulled it back from the dead is a story most people have never heard. A man named Robert Church Sr., the son of an enslaved seamstress, stayed when others ran, and he bet on the ruined city. He bought up devalued land when everyone else was fleeing it, and when Memphis needed money to claw its way out of bankruptcy, he bought the very first municipal bond the recovering city issued. He's often described as one of the South's first black millionaires, and whether or not that exact title holds, his faith in the place was real money on the table when nobody else was buying. Here's the theme to file away. Memphis learned, early and brutally, that its very existence was negotiable at the boundary. What counted as Memphis could be granted, revoked, redrawn, or rebuilt. The city survived by manipulating what counted as itself, a habit that would come back to haunt it a century later. By the spring of 1968, the slow drift of people out of the city's center was about to become something far harder to reverse. It started, as these things often do, with two men whose names most of the country never learned. Ecole Cole and Robert Walker were sanitation workers. In February 1968, sheltering from rain inside the compactor of an aging garbage truck, they were crushed to death when the machinery malfunctioned. They were black, they were poor, and the city offered their families almost nothing. That was the spark. Memphis's sanitation workers walked off the job and went on strike, carrying placards that said 4 words that have outlived everyone who marched that day. I am a man. It was a demand for dignity as much as wages, a refusal to be treated as disposable as the trash they hauled. The strike drew Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis. He came to support the workers, to lend the weight of the national movement to a local fight over dignity and pay, and he stayed at the Lorraine Motel. On April 4th, 1968, he was assassinated there on the balcony, and the shock of it tore through the city and the nation. I'm not going to dwell on the violence itself. What matters for this story is what came after. The trauma hardened lines that were already forming and accelerated a flight that was already underway. Families with the means to leave the urban core pulled out faster, moving to the edges and beyond, taking their savings and their tax dollars with them. The question Memphis now faced wasn't whether people were leaving, it was what the city would do to chase them. The city's answer to losing its people was, on its face, almost clever. If the residents and their tax dollars were fleeing to the suburbs, then Memphis would simply bring the city to them. It would annex. It would reach out and pull the fleeing suburbs back inside the city limits, capturing the tax base by swallowing the ground it stood on. As long as the boundary kept expanding, the official population could hold steady and the budget could keep breathing. But look closely at what that actually did, because this is the engine of the whole tragedy. The county was, at the very same time, subsidizing the sprawl that was pulling everyone out, paying to build the roads and the schools and the water lines in the brand new towns on the edge. So Memphis was helping fund the construction of the very places its residents were running to, then chasing after them with a boundary line to tax them once they got there. It was like bailing water out of one end of a boat and pouring it back in the other. Suburbs like Collierville and Bartlett exploded. Clean new subdivisions, fresh schools, cul-de-sacs spreading across what had been farmland a few years before. Meanwhile, original 1970s city limits, the real, historic Memphis, the population dropped by roughly a quarter. Storefronts that once served packed neighborhoods went dark. Houses emptied. The tax dollars that should have maintained the core followed the families out to the rim. The map got bigger and bigger, while the heart got emptier and emptier. The city was, in the most literal sense, financing its own hollowing. Every acre it swallowed spread it thinner and poorer, and the more land it absorbed to look healthy on paper, the sicker the actual core became. Here's the part that makes Memphis almost impossible to believe. While all of this draining was happening, the city was busy handing the entire world its culture and moving the planet's economy through its airport, and still couldn't keep its own people. This is the birthplace of the blues, the place where the sound of the American South was poured into records and shipped everywhere. It's where rock and roll was arguably born, Sun Studio, Beale Street. The recording's widely considered the first rock and roll songs ever cut. Walk down Beale Street even now and you're walking the stretch where the music that reshaped the entire 20th century first found its voice. And it didn't stop with culture. Memphis is home to the FedEx Superhub, a sorting operation so vast it has, at times, ranked among the busiest cargo airports on the planet. Every night in the dark, planes pour in from across the world, and an enormous share of the packages people order everywhere physically pass through Memphis, sorted, scanned, and flung back out before sunrise to land on doorsteps 1,000 miles away. The world's overnight economy runs through this one city while most of the world sleeps. Global culture flowed out of Memphis, global commerce flowed through it. The influence and the wealth were staggering, and the population kept falling anyway, decade after decade. Which teaches a hard lesson about cities. Being important and keeping your people are two completely different things. A place can matter enormously to the world and still be unable to hold the people who built it, which sets up the single strangest move in modern American urban policy. Most cities will do almost anything to grow. Memphis decided to do the opposite, out loud on the record as official policy. After half a century of grabbing land, the city looked at the wreckage of that strategy and chose to reverse it. The plan is called Memphis 3.0, and its slogan is almost a confession: build up, not out. Stop spreading. Pour the money back into the core that decades of annexation had drained. And then came the move that broke every instinct American cities are built on: de-annexation. Memphis began deliberately shedding the land it had spent 50 years acquiring, cutting loose far-flung pieces like the river bottoms, Eads, and South Cordova, handing territory back to the county rather than hoarding it. Imagine the paperwork. A city formally drawing its own borders inward, voting to become physically smaller, releasing the very ground it had fought to capture. The mayor at the time, Jim Strickland, described it as something that may well make Memphis the first major American city to voluntarily shrink itself. Think about how upside down that is. Every other city measures success in square miles gained. Memphis decided its survival depended on giving square miles back. The inversion finally completes itself. The city that once grew by spreading was now trying to grow by contracting. But reversing a 50-year pattern runs straight into a problem that no map redrawing can outrun. The trouble with shrinking on purpose is that the math underneath it can turn vicious. Memphis carries deep, entrenched poverty. For years it is ranked at or near the top of large American cities by poverty rate, depending on which year you measure. And poverty like that doesn't just sit there. It compounds. Now layer on a new pressure. A 2026 Tennessee law ties the distribution of certain tax revenue directly to population, which means every single resident the city loses now cuts its budget that much further. Read that again, because it's a trap with teeth. Fewer people means less money. Less money means fewer services, rougher streets, weaker schools, and less reason for anyone to stay. Which means more people leave, which means even less money the next year, and the year after that. The loop doesn't loosen. It tightens with every turn. The decline stops being something that merely happened to Memphis and becomes something that feeds on itself. Each loss making the next loss more likely until the city is fighting not just its history, but its own arithmetic. The open question hanging over the whole place now is brutal in its simplicity. Is voluntary contraction an actual cure, or just a more dignified version of a slow bleed? Go back to where we started. That footprint sprawled across the map, bigger than Chicago and nearly empty. Now you can see it for what it really is. The emptiness was never the land's fault. The bluff is still there, still dry, still commanding the greatest river on the continent, exactly as it was when those speculators first sketched out a town in 1819. The river never abandoned Memphis. Memphis spread itself thin, chasing growth in the worst possible direction. And the hollow you can see from space tonight is simply the price of that chase. That's what makes Memphis the opposite of every American city. Everywhere else, getting bigger is winning. Memphis is the one place that proved you can grow yourself straight into ruin. And the one place now betting that the only way forward is to get smaller. If you found this fascinating, watch one of the videos on screen right now and drop a comment telling me whether you think a city can actually save itself by shrinking.